So, sweethearts, let's just summarize what we did last week and then move on again. So often traditionally the lamas would give a teaching, then they would say it a second time but shorter, and a third time even shorter. It's like summarize, and it's really good for the mind to go back on what we've heard before. So mainly last week we just went the broadest overview, you know, in the Buddhist view, the broadest overview of what the mind is and what the mind isn't. And I highly recommend that you read your course notes, because T.Y. Alexander, she's one of my colleagues, she says many things that I mightn't say, because each person has their own style. We all cover the points in the end, but she's got her own way of saying it. So it's very helpful to read her course notes. I really recommend you do that. So mind in Buddhism is the absolute center of everything. And this is something that we really do not, this is where it's radically different from the materialist, the philosophical materialist view, which of course is the view that we all are familiar with, the world that's the view that prevails mostly in the world today, the so-called scientific view. There's these fundamental points, fundamental differences. So before, and even before we say this, just remember, it's so important that when listening to these words, might be a brand new idea for us. So the approach has to be, you can't possibly prove something in the beginning, right? You might hear 1 + 1 is 2 for the first time. You can't possibly prove it immediately. You've got to go think about it and do your homework and prove it to yourself. And that's everything. So the approach you're taking is that you're working hypothesis. I see, my teacher says 1 + 1 is 2. Okay, I'll memorize that. I'll look into that. Same here. This is a huge approach. One of the biggest problems we have with spiritual philosophical teachings is we assume we're supposed to believe them, because we have this strong assumption that you can't prove them. Now that's the view I would suggest in the creator religious philosophical views. I mean, if you can prove that God, that there is God, that God is right, then you're virtually God as well, and you can't talk like that. But this is not the approach in Buddhism, So to remind us where these teachings come from, well, they're from the mouths of the lamas that I've studied from, all my teachers, Dalai Lama, Lama Zopa, Lama Yeshe, all my, the people from, and then tracking back through to the Nalanda tradition in India, tracking right back to the Buddha. So these teachings are coming from the Buddha, supposedly this. And if you can prove it's wrong, then absolutely you must do so. So what we're talking here is Buddha's view. So Buddha is not a creator. Buddha does not make these things up. He is not speculating. He has found Buddhism is, if it's valid, it is coming directly from the experience of the Buddha and anybody else who's followed those technology and also become a Buddha. So that's the view here. That's the view we're taking. So from Buddha's own direct experiential observation and his own direct experience, consciousness and mind, one, are not physical. With absolute clarity, they're not physical. And like I said last week, I think the whole of Buddhism is based upon this. If you can prove it to be wrong, then the whole of Buddhism collapses into a heap of nonsense. It's not coherent. So consciousness and mind are not physical. They're not the brain. They depend upon the brain at the grosser level, no question. We have grosser level of consciousness and we have subtler level. So the first point is not physical. Second point, there are these subtler levels of capacity for cognition. Because if you want to say what the job of the mind is to cognize, to be aware, to know that which exists. So one point the Buddha is making, we mentioned this last week, is the word Buddha is the end result of all this work, and it tells us exactly what the job is. That is, the Buddha implies the eradication of all delusions from the mind, and Da implies the development to perfection of all the goodness in the mind, speaking very simply. So mind is central, mind is fundamental, mind is central in Buddhism. It's not physical. It has got much subtler levels of cognition that do not depend upon the physical. This is something the Indians discovered well before the Buddha. Mind, the other crucial point, fundamental point, that's absolutely the basis of all Buddhist practice. And it's quite shocking because it's completely not the view we have in the modern world, in the modern psychological models, and it's not the view we have in Christianity or Islam, creator. We are not we're not the handiwork of anybody else. This is something absolutely crucial in Buddhism. Your consciousness is not the handiwork of your parents because it's not physical. And your consciousness or any part of your being there's no part of your being that's the handiwork of a creator. This is a hugely different view in the Buddhist spiritual philosophical teachings, So if your mind doesn't come from, so what does the mind refer to? Thoughts, feelings, emotions, unconscious, subconscious, instinct, intuition, this entire spectrum of your inner being. All of this is consciousness. All of this is mind. And the Buddha has found that this mind can be perfected. This mind can be rid of the rubbish and full of the goodness. This is the end result of this entire job of being a Buddhist. So clearly then we need to know what the mind is if this is the case. The job of being a Buddhist is knowing your mind, unpacking and unraveling your mind, radically reconfiguring your mind, molding your mind, as Lama Zopa would put it, into the shape of a Buddha. So the job is the mind. The job is psychological. So it's not physical, not the handiwork of mummy, daddy, or creator, is dependent upon, it functions interdependently with a physical level, but only at the gross level. We've got these subtle levels of cognition that do not depend upon a brain, do not depend upon the physical and the nervous system. And the other point, if it doesn't come from a creator and doesn't come from mummy, daddy, well, what's its source? Well, it can't come from nothing. If everything is the product of cause and effect, as Buddha's definitely pointing out, then there can't be something that has no cause. There can't be a first, in that sense, there can't be a first moment. Not possible. The Christians have detailed philosophical teachings about this. There can be how it's viable to have a first cause, not for the Buddha. So consciousness, therefore, logically, and this is what's shocking to us, bizarre, we talked last week, consciousness is a beginningless continuity of mental moments. Because each second you get to this moment, you think, well, where did I begin? Well, maybe it's that moment there. Well, if you began there, what was the cause of it? It can't be somebody else. It can't be something physical. It has to be something similar character, which is not physical. So you always have to keep going back to a previous moment and a previous moment and a previous moment. As nutty as this sounds to us, we've really got to think this through logically and become familiar with this concept. And of course, the Mahayana, the Prasangika Madhyamika view in the teachings is the mind never ends. Once you've fully developed your mind into the mind of a Buddha, you don't just disappear into space. You continue to manifest throughout universes for the benefit of sentient beings. So the other point here is then the potential. This is where the radical difference is. The potential of this mind of ours. From the Mahayana perspective, the potential is to become a Buddha, to rid the mind of all the rubbish and full of all the goodness. Another way of putting it is that the mind has its job is to cognize. The verb to cognize, the verb to be aware, the verb to know. These are synonymous. And this is a key thing for the Buddha, that the mind's job is to cognize that which exists. This is a huge point in Buddhist philosophy and psychology. The mind's job is to cognize that which exists. Right now, that's what we're going to start going into details today, into our mental consciousness, to see that we've got these states of mind that are not in sync with that which exists. This is a crucial point that Buddha's making. So these are the points we discussed last week. So mind is not physical, not the handiwork of mummy, daddy, creator. It is beginningless. It doesn't depend upon the brain at a subtle level. It's not itself the brain, and it continues on and on. And this is where the law of karma comes in. It's not technically the part of the job of when we just study the mind to study karma, but there's nothing wrong with bringing it in because it's so utterly integrated. The law that runs the mind, the law that runs the universe, the law within which the universe runs, is the law of karma, the law of cause and effect, such that whatever our mind does, thinks, and then on the basis of which we do and say with the servants of the mind, the body and speech, this is the process of quote unquote creating karma. So it's utterly to do with the mind. Karma is a separate topic. One of the modules will be karma. So we can't help, nothing wrong with bringing it in here. Karma, it's the mind that creates karma, and then its servants, the body and speech, then carry out the wishes of the mind. And this is how life. This is reality. This is existence. The other point about the mind is that for the Buddha, the wonderful word, the term that we use in English that translates the Tibetan term sem chen, sentient being, which is kind of nice, but the literal translation is delicious. I wish we could use it. It's literally mind possessor. So the Buddha's view is, we tend to use the word mind, I think, in our modern world in terms of a human being, not for the Buddha. There are trillions upon countless trillions of mind possessors, and humans are a tiny percentage of them. So, when we look into nirvana, samsara and nirvana, one of the modules, which Buddha asserts this whole spectrum of types of rebirth, types of sentient beings, types of mind possessors and their experiences, so-called realms of existence, So dogs and ants and monkeys and other beings we can't see are all mind possessors. And in fact, this is what's fascinating. This model of the mind, this view of the mind and how it functions, both the epistemological model and the psychological model, which we're going to go into, both of which, applies to all beings, which is quite surprising. I mean, I think in the modern psychological models, we do not apply modern psychology to animals. We probably can see similar, you can see jealousy and anger in animals too, but we don't kind of join the dots. We don't see it as the same model. This is what's utterly interesting about the Buddhist view. It's the model of the mind refers to all living beings without exception. So this is quite integrated. It's quite fascinating, quite unusual. So, okay, these are the general points about mind. And the other point to put, I mean, using with the law of karma, which is done by the mind, the mind is the creator of the universe. I mean, this might seem, it does seem incredibly abstract to us in the beginning to hear this. It's quite shocking to hear this, that the mind is the creator of all our realms of existence, all happiness and all suffering. The mind is literally the creator of the universe. We don't need a creator. We're our own creator. We do fine making our own mess, and we do fine happily making our own happiness. This is quite a shocking concept. We tend to think there has to be a boss. That's the concept of a creator. Don't need a boss. Minds create their own reality. Minds create their own suffering, and minds create their own happiness. This is the biggest shock to us. Other things play a role, no question, but the mind is the main player. This is the key point that Buddha's making. So, okay, let's go into some details then. When TY's course notes are very helpful. Later on, she discusses the psychological model, and discusses there's a particular text that's studied in the monasteries. It's known as Lorig, Mind and Awareness. And there's both the epistemological model and the psychological model. And then in the psychological model, it mentions something like 51 different states of mind. In fact, the Buddha would assert thousands of states of mind. Generally speaking, they talk about how Buddha asserts 84,000 neurotic states of mind. And then there are 84,000 antidotes to those, which are the virtuous states of mind. But I remember I always asked the Geshis, can you please point to which text I'm going to find a list of these 84,000? They never seem to know where it is. I don't know what happened, but this is how they talk. The 84,000. But what's marvelous, Buddha, as we hear very often, if you read any Buddhist book, you're going to hear the term the three poisons. Well, all these 84,000 very comfortably come down to subsume in these three. So the understanding these three, and this is when we get to the psychological model, is totally, it sounds so sweet, we've got the three poisons. You don't go to your therapist and say, I've got the three poisons. They'll laugh at you. We've got to have a Greek name, and it's got to be intense. Attachment, anger, ignorance. Sounds so cute. But if we understand these three, I tell you, we can deeply understand our own mind and deeply understand other people. There's no question about this, because all the others come down to these three. In fact, Ling Rinpoche, the young reincarnated, the reincarnation of Ling Rinpoche, the root guru of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, one of the main lamas in the Gelug tradition. He's now 30-something, maybe young, maybe 40, I can't remember. He comes quite a lot and teaches in Europe and Australia, in the UK, other places, America. And I remember he often says, and I hadn't heard this before, it's in the text though, he often says, 21,000 of those 84,000 are rooted in ignorance, the first of these three poisons, because we're going to discuss these today. The second of these this next 21,000 are rooted in the second one, which is called attachment. And the third lot of 21,000 are rooted in the third one called aversion. And then the fourth 21,000 are rooted in all three. In other words, there's this coherent kind of map of the mind. And that these states of mind, which in our world, we're familiar, anger, we're very familiar with that word. Attachment, maybe we're not familiar with that one. We define it very differently. Aversion, ignorance, maybe it's peculiar. Buddha's got very specific, understanding of these words. So when you study this text, Lorig, mind and awareness, there's two parts. The first part is the epistemological model, and this itself is utterly, incredibly fascinating. It's the actual way that this cognitive process known as the mind functions. And remember, we're not discussing the brain. We're discussing the internal, subjective, experiential thing called mind. This is what the word refers to in Buddhism. There's no discussion of the brain. There's no argument there is a brain. No one's complaining about brain science. We're not just, the way I think I might have mentioned last week, without insulting neuroscientists, you could easily say that the brain and what goes on in the physical are the physical indicators of what goes on in the mind. This is probably the best way to put it. So nothing wrong. I mean, marvelous to study the mind, to study the brain, brilliant, but study both and their relationship. And this is why these marvelous talks this last 30, 40 years with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, and the best brains in the Tibetan Buddhist world, discussing with the best brains in the modern psychological systems and scientific models, having these wonderful discussions. And there's so much meeting between these views now, which is brilliant. And that's one of His Holiness's main gifts to the world. He's bringing supposed different groups together, politically, spiritually, scientifically. It's marvelous, And there's so much of this is published now. Okay, so it goes into, it's marvelous, the detail about the way the mind, the mind functions in the epistemological model. I'm not going to go too much into this, but certain fundamental points are really crucial, to understand. And I'm sure in TY's course notes, she discusses this. But, one of the books that's been recommended that you study is a book by Geshe Tashi, who was the resident teacher at our center in London, Jamyang. He's now the abbot of Seramay Monastery in India. And it's been published. It's called simply Buddhist Psychology. It's one of the several course books in his own particular course called I forget it's called, but it's a very excellent presentation. It's taught to modern people. So he's speaking in our terms, in its own presentation of the way the mind is, both the psychological model and the epistemological model. I think it's a brilliant book to use as background, because I'm going to touch on only certain points, So the key point about the epistemological model, you can say, and this is a slightly different way than they present it, but this is for me very experiential. There are two different ways that our mind functions. One is sensory consciousness, and one is mental consciousness. So there's two ways of dividing, and it mentions in the text. One way they talk about it, dividing the two ways, is into, and this is a bit abstract for us, and I don't go into this one too much, but it's crucial to understand it. They also talk about how the two different ways in the epistemological model, one is we have direct, kind of a cognition that's direct, that's direct. They call it direct perception. It's a very specific definition. The other one is conception. So direct perception, the sensory consciousness is direct. There's nothing in between. Eye consciousness cognizes certain things. Ear consciousness cognizes. It's a very simple kind of way of cognizing. Now, the other point is there is perception also in the mental consciousness, but only at a subtler level when you're in meditation. But so that's one way of dividing. But the other way I find it more helpful to divide, and this is really experiential, very experiential for us. We can spend the rest of today, and we might even want to see what happens. But we've got the sensory consciousness and we have the mental consciousness. Now, in our culture, just with our ego, the way we are, as Lama Yeshe puts it, we make the body the boss. So of course, in our modern view, there's nothing other than the body. We are only the body. So this is a very powerful feeling we have, that this bag of bones here, this is me, this is everything. It's the body, this is me. So clearly we know we have thoughts and feelings, but we think of them still as a function of the brain. So we still think of them as physical, but not for the Buddha. So the sensory and the mental, it is crucial to even know first intellectually the difference between them. It's very telling. I mean, it's a very simple example I would use, like I always use my thermos. I have my little handy thermos here with my hot water, which I have to drink from. Excuse me, I'm dry. Santa Fe is very high and the air is very dry here. I'm not complaining, just telling you. I think it's 4,500, or can't be meters, maybe 7,000 feet. I can't remember. Whatever it is, it's high. Anyway, here we have I will tell you, I will say, I'll look at this, you watch me, you'll see me look at this thermos and I'll go, oh, it's a really well-designed thermos. Now, without any analysis, we're going to assume that Rabina's eyes are cognizing a well-designed thermos. I look at, where's my boyfriend today? Lord knows. Don't know who's there's Mark. Hello, Mark. Haven't seen you for centuries. You're going to be my boyfriend. Okay, Mark's my boyfriend. Okay, he's my friend from centuries ago. So I look at Mark and I say, wow, Mark is so handsome. We all know this thinking. And we don't analyze, we don't unpack this, but it's really quite profound if we can begin to understand the difference and apply this every day. This is a huge practice, I tell you. And it's fairly evident, what I'm going to tell you is fairly evident when we think about it. So we say, Mark is so divine, So that means my eyes are seeing handsome Mark. Well, let's look at what the job of the sensory consciousness is. That's how they talk, eye consciousness, ear consciousness, tongue consciousness, etc. So okay. In general, how they talk about the mind, in general, the way the mind cognizes, whatever level of your mind, whatever part of your mind, mind is subject. This is the way they talk. And Lama Yeshe talks about this in his marvelous book called Mahamudra. The mind is like a mirror. The mind is the subject. They talk about subject, and then it always has an object. Whatever level of cognition you are, from the grossest level to the most subtle in the deepest meditation, there's always the mind cognizing something. Mind can't not have an object. It's a bizarre concept. An object here doesn't mean a physical thing. It means the thing that the mind cognizes. So what are the objects of the sensory consciousnesses? Well, straight away, right there, they are not handsome Mark. They are not a well-designed thermos. So what happens is this. Eye consciousness, in fact, the sensory consciousnesses are profoundly limited in their capacity for cognition. Eye consciousness can cognize precisely two things, shape and color. That's it, shape and color. So then you have to ask the question, because eye consciousness lands on this shape and color, which we know is labeled Mark. So then if I say divine handsome Mark, we have to ask which part of my mind is cognizing divine handsome Mark. Well, honeys, that's your mental consciousness. So you've got your sensory and your mental. They've got completely separate function. But of course, we're totally programmed. So we completely merge these together as one experience. Really, the whole of our discussion for the next 3 or whatever many weeks we've got left could be just on the distinction between the sensory and the mental. This is where you really apply this stuff experientially every day, not just some interesting intellectual concepts. It's so powerful, So what part of my mind then is the obvious question? If we only have mental consciousness and sensory, and if my eye consciousness can only cognize shape and color, then it's logical you must ask, well, which part of my mind is doing the cognizing and that we label handsome divine Mark? Well, that's our mental consciousness. And that's where the workshop is, as Lama Yeshe puts it, Lama Zopa. And this is the main discussion about the mind. When we can locate and isolate the sensory from the mental, even first intellectually, we begin to really understand our mind. And the real job is being our own therapist, as Lama Yeshe puts it, is delving into this workshop, delving into the thoughts and feelings and emotions and unconscious and subconscious, which are the contents of our mental consciousness. So basically what happens is this: the millisecond my eye consciousness lands on that thermos or Mark, and of course familiar with Mark, so and this is really not kidding, but quicker than Google, and I'm really meaning that. Lama Yeshe says in Mahamudra, when you've really begun to discover the true nature of your mind, even just getting single pointed concentration, which we're going to talk about, technically it comes in a later discussion, but it's really relevant here. When you've got single point of concentration, you can't even imagine the brilliance and clarity of your mind. Lama says it's like more clever, more brilliant, more fast, more amazing than the best computer in the universe. And they mean this quite sincerely. And when you read the capacity of the mind when it's developed, even just with single point of concentration, it's like science fiction to us. There's no equivalent techniques or possibility of this in modern psychology. The mind is incredible, So quicker than Google, my mental consciousness is accessed. So what's the contents of the mental consciousness? Well, the level we function at now, it's all thoughts. And we know from the second we wake up in the morning until the second we go to sleep at night, there's this unceasing, isn't it? Series of thoughts, 1,000 a second. Even modern psychology says that. This uncontrolled, berserk, uncontrolled, unedited, constant flow of thoughts. So that's the source of divine handsome mark. Basically, the level we function at the mental consciousness level. Remember, we've got these subtler levels, non-conceptual direct perception when you're in the subtlest meditation and you begin to get genuine experiences of things in meditation. But we don't touch direct perception, as they call it, in the mental consciousness. We live at the level of conceptuality. Now, this includes all our emotions, and we're going to be going into that. But so what happens is basically divine handsome mark, well-designed thermos, every opinion we ever come up with about the entire external world, it is a series of thoughts, opinions, viewpoints. And the Buddha is basically saying those viewpoints, those opinions in the mental consciousness are divided into neurotic, ridiculous, deluded, distorted, exaggerated viewpoints that have no real basis in reality. And they are the source of all our pain. Then you've got the valid, reasonable, virtuous viewpoints. And they are reasonable, and we need to grow those. And then the third lot, usually these are called negative, positive, and neutral. And we're going to describe that, because it's very confusing initially. And this third lot, neutral, sounds really like as if they're not important, but I like to call them the mechanics of the mind. And they're the parts of our mind. So an example of the first lot, and this is certainly in the case of Mark, if I'm in love with Mark, then what's rampant in my mind is under the first category. It's called the negative, neurotic, deluded, ridiculous ones, and it's called attachment, which is this, we're going to go into discussing these. So that's the one really running the show. And one of the key jobs of all the neuroses, all the delusions, all the disturbing emotions, it's one of their key functions, being conceptual stories, is to exaggerate certain aspects of the object. So in this case, attachment to Mark means attachment in my mind is grossly exaggerating his deliciousness. If I'm angry with Mark when he chucks me out for a younger version, now my anger in this first category of states of mind, neurotic, deluded ones, which is the response when attachment is thwarted, my aversion, my anger now exaggerates Mark's ugliness, because we all know this. If I discover today he's cheating on me, you analyze, how will he appear to your eyes now? Seemingly to your eyes, not your eyes. Your eyes is the same shape and color as yesterday. The same shape and color. He hasn't got an extra wrinkle since yesterday. Exactly the same shape and color. If you saw a photo of Mark yesterday and you see a photo of Mark today, no difference. But look at the mind. Yesterday I was in love with him. Attachment was rampant. I painted the most divine picture of the best person in the universe, isn't it? And now today I loathe the man, offended and brokenhearted, and now he appears literally ugly to my mind. I mean, already this should blow our mind, but we never join the dots. We think our eyes are seeing a handsome Mark. We think our eyes are seeing an ugly Mark. Now, if you saw Mark, again, the same, if you saw Mark yesterday and you see Mark today, you'll go, huh? Handsome, ugly? What are you talking about? It's obvious it's not your eyes. It is obvious your eyes aren't changed overnight. It's obvious Mark is the same shape and color as yesterday. Pretty much. It's clear. It's a conceptual story in your mental consciousness. But because we are so deeply familiar with these states of mind, we don't join the dots, we don't question. And this is the worst one. This is the killer about these negative states of mind. Whatever story arises in my mind, I believe it is true. So yesterday, I believe he was handsome. The same bloke tomorrow, I believe he's ugly. So it shows how demented we are. It shows how insane we are. We don't do analysis. We don't analyze and break down and unpack and unravel these conceptual stories. So this is the job of being a Buddhist. This is the job of being a Buddhist, to unpack and unravel your conceptual stories, because they are the mental states. They're in the mental consciousness. nothing to do with the senses, you know. But it's clear, isn't it, speaking just experientially, that the sensory consciousnesses are powerful for us. They're the first step. They're the first level of any experience we have is sensory. And so what we do is we give it, as Lama Yeshe puts it, we give enormous power to our sensory experiences, you know, enormous, far more power than they actually have. And we don't do this clear distinction, this clear distinguishing between the sensory experience and the mental experience. So that's why we first have to understand the model psychologically, and then applying this every day. Because the thing is, most of the time in the day, you check it, we judge whether we're happy or not based upon our sensory feelings, based upon our sensory consciousnesses, don't we? Think about it. You know, the sun is just pleasant and it shines on your body and it's a pleasant feeling. Then you say, I'm happy. I mean, the sensory is the immediate one. And then it dominates our lives. Our sensory experiences absolutely dominate our lives. So, you know, for example, let's say, you know, it is a sensory experience when my knee hurts. It's the body. It's a sensory. It's a tactile consciousness, and it's experience, and there's a pain. There's an experience of pain. So this is where we see that we don't separate the sensory from the mental, and this is a massive practice. That, you know, because there's pain in my body, therefore my attachment's not getting what it wants. I'm jumping ahead a bit and describing all this, but we're going to go into detail of these different states of mind. Because there's pain in my body, the next millisecond, because attachment, which is the junkie in us that only wants nice feelings, because attachment's not getting what it wants, instantaneously aversion arises in our mind. So the logic for us is, well, of course I'm upset. I've got a pain in my knee. But upset is a mental state. Pain in the knee is a sensory one. They're different. So we can choose. This is the point about what practice is. This is exactly what practice is. And understanding the difference between the sensory and the mental is part of that process. We are like servants of our body completely. The moment there's a pleasant feeling, we can't help but think, well, of course I'm happy. The moment there's an unpleasant feeling, a pain in my knee, we just assume, well, of course I'm unhappy. So in other words, we have no control over our mental states at all. We are just servants of our body. And therefore, that's why one of our main attachments, which is mental, is to be in our physical comfort zone. Pleasant sound, pleasant smell, pleasant taste, pleasant weather, pleasant food. And we spend most of our day basing what we think happiness is on, you know, on the view that as long as the senses are comfortable, then that's what samsara is. Buddha says it's like, that's what ants and dogs and animals and the monkeys and the ants do, you know. We've got to go beyond that. So the crucial point here is to just see the difference, first intellectually, and then begin to experience the difference between the sensory and the mental. I mean, this is an enormous point, actually, you know. We just glom them together. So the sensory consciousnesses, each have got their own object. Ear consciousness, you know, I'll hear one trumpet note and I'll bliss out and go, wow, Miles Davis, you know. So I'm assuming my ear consciousness is hearing divine Miles Davis, hearing a trumpet. No, not possible, not capable. Ear consciousness, all the senses are profoundly limited in their capacity for cognition. So the ear consciousness hears mere sound. You know, that's it. So again, next millisecond, my mental consciousness is accessed quicker than Google. And because I'm familiar with Miles Davis, I'm familiar with that trumpet, that sound, it's all stored in my memory, which is the mental consciousness. And this, by the way, is something fascinating in the Buddhist view, that there's nothing any sentient being ever experiences through any of the five senses or through the mind, the mental consciousness, that goes astray. Everything is stored in the mind. This is very powerful. This is very delicious, actually. So if you take the view that Buddha says your mind has had beginningless lifetimes, then that means everything you've ever experienced is in your mind held there as a memory. So it shows how limited we are right now. And this is one of the points about mental consciousness. The level we function at mental consciousness is extremely gross, extremely coarse. I mean, even now, for me, it's 11:45 in the afternoon here, 11:45 in the morning. If you ask me to sit down and account for every second of what I thought and have experienced since I woke up, I'd be a total failure. All of us would. We maybe remember a half a dozen things and we've already distorted the memory of it because it's been seen through the lenses of our attachment, you know. So our minds are so limited at a conceptual level, so utterly limited. But the Buddha's view is, as we progress, as we lessen the delusions, as we grow our virtues, as we get more wisdom, we literally, and as we get more power in our concentration meditation, we literally, I mean, literally expand the capacity for cognition of our consciousness. We see the past, we see the future, we can see the minds of others. All this is capacity of our mind. And this is not how we talk in, you know, neuroscience. It's very fascinating what Buddha's saying. The mind is phenomenally powerful. What its potential is unbelievable, you know, both in terms of happiness, but also in terms of power and capacity. This is Buddha's view. So the senses are profoundly limited. But because we're so addicted to our bodies, we define ourselves in terms of our body. That's all we think we are. Even when we discuss our emotions, we don't even know. This is one of the big points. We're going to go into this. We don't even know, most of us, because our body's so powerful, because our sensory experiences are so powerful, because the body looms large for us, then we don't even notice our emotions, which are in the mental consciousness, until the body feels them. So this is really like the tip of the iceberg. The body is actually gross. We think feelings in the body are kind of powerful, but we don't even know how to know what is going on in our mental consciousness until our body experiences it. In other words, you know, like if you've got a tendency to be angry, you don't know your thoughts are angry until you're shouting. If you are a tendency to be more quiet, but your aversion has built up over many months and years, you don't know you have depression until you are inert in bed, unable to move. So we don't even pay attention to our thoughts and feelings and emotions, only when they're at the level of the physical, because the body and the mental are intimately connected. You can't say they're not connected. So we only notice what's happening in our mental consciousness, which is necessarily subtler than our sensory, until we only notice what's happening when the body feels it. And that's kind of like too late. This is our thing, and this is the modern world. This is how we are. And we even kind of, we kind of think the physical feelings, people talk about feeling things in their body. I'm not being insulting, because we do. And we need to describe this. This is not technically part of the sutra teachings. This is going to be part of coming from the Vajrayana, but I find it extremely helpful to understand it. We'll go into this, you know, we'll look at it. So the body, okay, I'll look at it now because it's really helpful in the Vajrayana. The body and the mind are intimately, inextricably linked. It's extremely obvious, you know. So the Vajrayana model is so helpful to understand, actually. So, you know, for example, in the Vajrayana model, and we learn about this when we do the module on death. We're going to be going into this because the death process itself, which is really beautifully articulated, detailed the technology of what happens as you're dying, this deconstructing of the components of the person physically and mentally. It's very fascinating. We'll be going into all this, and this is straight from the Vajrayana model. So the Vajrayana model of the universe is there are trillions and trillions and trillions of minds, mind possessors. And then all those minds are inextricably linked to their own set of the four elements. The matter, there's only the matter and minds in the universe, basically. And then minds are not physical. And then there's matter, and matter consists of the four elements. That's it. That's the universe. And minds, each individual mind stream is intimately and inextricably linked to its own set of the four elements. So this is roughly like the Chinese model. This is certainly the Tibetan medical systems model. This is a bit like the Ayurvedic model, and probably how we talked a few centuries ago in Europe, you know, the four elements. So the body and so we've got the gross consciousness. This is from Vajrayana, okay? It's not in this, but I find it helpful to discuss it here. So you've got your gross consciousness, which is your sensory. And that, of course, is utterly dependent upon the existence of a proper eyeball. So the eyeball doesn't cognize shape and color. Your eye consciousness combined with the eyeball, speaking simply, that enables there to be a cognition of shape and color. Ear consciousness working in conjunction with the subtler bits of the physical enables me to have the cognition of, of the sound of the trumpet. So they're inextricably linked. There's no question. But mind is not the physical and physical is not the mind. That's why it's so important. They're linked inextricably, but they're not the same, This is a crucial understanding. So then you've got the subtle level of mind. And this is the same process that happens every time you go to sleep. Once you become unconscious, your sensory consciousness has ceased, your grosser level of capacity for cognition has ceased, and you become unconscious. And now, and that's the same as at the time of death. So now your subtle mind, when you start to dream, that's your subtle consciousness. That's the sense, that's your mental states, and they are inextricably linked with this subtle physical energy, which consists of these 72,000 subtle channels through which course these subtle wind energies. So if you go to your Tibetan doctor, she will feel your pulses. And she can feel, she's intimately familiar, like your Chinese, doctors, intimately familiar with all these different wind energies coursing through your body. And she knows each one of them is linked to certain states of mind. So she'll feel the total imbalance of certain wind energies. And she knows that that's related to your attachment. That's why you're having uncontrolled thoughts. That's why your mind is berserk. That's why you're anxious. That's why you're having panic attacks. All of it. So this mind and body at this level, they even say the mind rides on the winds. So the balance of health in the Tibetan medical system, like the Chinese, you get your herbal medicines that work on those wind energies that calm them down, and then the states of mind connected to those winds then become calm. It's a very marvelous model, and it's very subtle and very very intuitive. So of course your body and mind is involved. It's clear. But the thing is, unless we become familiar with the actual thought processes themselves, which is why we need to learn to get some concentration and why we need to learn to become our own therapist, as Lama Yeshe puts it, just to begin to become familiar. First, get the model, the theoretical model clear. What are these different states of mind? And our job is to learn to distinguish between them. So of course you start with your body, nothing wrong. You feel it in your body, as you say. But you've got to go deeper than that. You've got to go deeper and unpack and unravel beyond the physical, because the physical is merely the indicator of what's happening in our mind. And it's too late to notice the mind when only the body feels it. This is the biggest problem. In other words, like I said, if you're angry and you don't pay attention to your thoughts, then you'll only know you're angry when you're screaming at somebody. This is literally true. Oh, wow, what happened? I'm angry, because you're not paying attention to your thoughts. And then if you're the kind of person who then, more quiet, let's say, like I said before, and doesn't vomit out your anger, you only notice aversion, because that's what depression is. It's internalized anger. It's internalized aversion. We're going to go into all this. Then you only notice that when you can't move because you're inert with depression. So noticing our thoughts and feelings and emotions only when we notice the effect on our body, way too late. This is the key brilliance of Buddhist psychology. He gives us the skills to enable us to become conscious of our thoughts and feelings before they get to the grosser level. That's the job of being a Buddhist. This is the job of being a Buddhist, That's why we have to have some concentration. We have to have some private practice time. We have to have some practicing, at least focusing. And then first you have to have a theory. It's like, mindfulness, this is where, again, we're going to bring in we're going to bring in mindfulness and discuss it and the concentration meditation technique, although technically it belongs in another module. I can't help mix them all together. You can't help that, but it's okay. That, what was I going to say? Mindfulness. Okay, never mind. That'll come later. Don't you worry. So, okay, the body and the mind are intimately linked, but they're separate. They've got different functions. And we have to learn this first theoretically, then slowly apply it. And then it's a revelation. Even just simply the fact that if you have a pain in the knee, you don't need to be angry. You can decide. But we assume pain means I'm going to be angry. We assume when it's a pleasant taste, you've got to be happy. We have no control over our thoughts because we're run by our physical experiences. This is one of our major sufferings in the world, What time is it? About an hour. Okay, look, I think, okay, good. I want to go into detail now about the mental conscious. I mean, I've hardly even mentioned the epistemological model. We can touch upon that a bit. I'll touch on it every now and again. But my main concern really is the psychological model, is the contents of our mind, the thoughts and feelings and emotions, which if you're familiar with me, you'll know that's all I ever talk about, So I hope you're not being disappointed. You're not going to hear anything new here. So come on then, any questions, people? Anybody on specifically anything from last week, or indeed anything from today, specific that we've talked about so far, not things we haven't talked about yet? Are there any questions? And if not, it's perfectly fine. Okay, I'll carry on then. So let's look into these let's look into the mental consciousness, and let's look into the conceptual stories that are in the mental consciousness. But before we go into the details, I think this is quite a hard point. This is very surprising to us. This is really quite shocking to us, actually. But the more we understand this particular point I'm about to say now, the more you get insight into yourself. Remember I said we've got two main ways the mind functions, either direct, what they call direct perception. These are the terms they use. So the senses are one example of that. They're easy. Direct, there's direct cognition. There's nothing in between. So that when it comes to the mental consciousness, and this way it is important to understand the way the mind functions. The mental consciousness is very, very abstract, how it comes up with concept. It comes up with its stories, but the mental consciousness, the level, it's got two levels of functioning. It's got conceptual, and then there's perception, which is non-conceptual. So the only time we effectively would experience a non-conceptual state of our mental consciousness would be in subtle meditation, not in ordinary daily life, virtually not at all. So that means we live in our daily life only in the mental consciousness, only at the level of conceptuality. Now, this is shocking. Because if we think conceptuality, we point to the head and we'll go, well, that's math, all these complex conceptual things, even theoretical music of, theoretic musical theory, say like say classical Western music, so conceptual, isn't it? So intellectual. So we think intellectual is conceptual. But what's shocking is the Buddhist view. This conceptual also includes what we would do when we point here, emotions. Anger, love, compassion, forgiveness, patience, kindness, arrogance, jealousy, depression. When we see those words, and as we know in Buddhist psychological literature, they refer to these as the disturbing emotions, the disturbing of the afflictions. There are various terms in Buddhist psychology referring to these. And if we divide all our mental consciousness, and you've heard me say this many times, and it's a lovely way to put it, as precisely three categories. All the millions of thoughts and feelings and emotions that we experience, they're all either negative, neurotic, delusional, disturbing, distorted, or valid, reasonable, virtuous, positive, or the third lot, I like to call them the mechanics of the mind. There's either one of these three, everything fits into those three categories, which is a fascinating model. I mean, it's much more simple sounding than, let's say, our 10 volumes of psychiatric mental illnesses or whatever, not being insulting. You either have a negative, neurotic, deluded, ridiculous state of mind, a valid, reasonable, positive state of mind, or a one that's the mechanics. And I call it that purposely because when we say negative, positive, and neutral, which are the usual three categories they use, neutral sounds very confusing because it sounds like they're not important. But what neutral means in this context, in the discussion of these conceptual stories in our mind, the level at which we function, the grosser level, at conceptual level only, that include the clever intellect, include the emotions. They're all conceptual stories. They're all viewpoints, thoughts. This is surprising to us to think that anger is a thought. When you see somebody shouting and yelling and spit coming out of their mouth, oh, they're having some angry thoughts. It sounds like a joke to us, If I'm having totally blissed out in love with divine, handsome, gorgeous Mark, he's the answer to all my prayers, blah, blah, blah. And I'm looking like I'm completely blissing out. And to say that I'm having a series of thoughts, it sounds hilarious. It sounds almost insulting, because we love the concept of feelings and emotions, They're all rooted in being conceptual stories. And to begin to see this, it's a revelation, and we can really begin to understand ourselves. So there are the negative in these three poisons of the Buddha that he very sweetly tells us about. These three main delusions. They talk that, okay, there's various terms for the negative ones. Delusion is a really brilliant word, actually, in English. In other languages, there's not a very good translation of it, but it really tells us the job of these. Other term is disturbing emotion. Another term is affliction. Lama Yeshe, in his Mahamudra book, I tell you, Lama was brilliant in making up terms to try to convey to us the meaning of these states of mind. I think I identified like 21 different terms that Lama had made up, these wonderful terms he uses, conceptual puzzles. I mean, these wonderful terms he comes with. The typical term in Buddhist psychology is affliction. So if you check it out, it's a fairly arcane word. We don't use it that often in daily life. So what kind of affliction? Well, it's obvious. It's a mental affliction, isn't it? A mental affliction. Sounds quite heavy. So normally, of course, in our psychological models, we give Greek names to all our mental illnesses, and we call them very comfortably mental illness. And if you're accused of having a mental illness, you feel quite upset, don't you? But this is what's fascinating. I think a really excellent term in modern language that is a perfect equivalent of affliction is mental illness. I mean, so what are these mental illnesses for the Buddha? Well, the root one, he calls it ignorance, but when it relates to this, its function is deeply ingrained, the most instinctive, most primordial, hard to recognize, but it's the root of all the others. It's this it's known colloquially as ego grasping when it relates to me. And its primordial energy is so subtle, so hard to see, but we can begin to see the symptoms of it. It's a total conceptual belief in the depth of our being that the Buddha would say we've been practicing for beginningless lifetimes, that believes utterly in a real, separate, solid, intrinsic, definite, independent me that can be found in here somewhere. That's the deepest affliction of all, the deepest delusion of all, the deepest mental illness. I think it's a great term. Shocking initially, because we think mental illness is way over there, but the Buddha happens to be saying being in samsara, quote unquote, by definition for the Buddha, means having one or other of these, or all of these delusions, variations of these delusions. That's the defining characteristic of being a samsaric person. Join the universe, babies. We've all got mental illnesses. It's shocking to hear this because this term is so strong for us, but it's a great synonym for affliction. It's what it means. So the root of these for all beings in the universe, such that when it's uprooted, that's what nirvana means. When you've finally uprooted that and perfected that realization, you've achieved your own liberation from suffering. Hence the root delusion, the most primordial, the hardest to identify. So on the basis of this, and there's a hierarchical relationship between these three, and indeed the 84,000, of course. So that automatically gives rise, because the feeling of this ego grasping is to be separate, bereft, it's fear-based, its nature is fear. There's a sense of separate me, unhappy, not fulfilled. So naturally it gives rise to attachment, this simple word. There's this emotional, that's primordially is dissatisfaction, then is emotional hunger, because naturally you feel there's something missing. The very nature of having ego grasping is that you feel less, not fulfilled. So emotional hunger, called attachment, is the next main one that it gives rise to, that then is dissatisfaction, which becomes emotional hunger, which then is like this little vampire that searches out there. The most obvious level of attachment's interest is the objects of the senses. That's why the senses are so powerful. But this is a mental state. Attachment is a mental state. It is not a function of the senses. But the senses, the feeling, you're desperate. This attachment is desperate to find something, cake, body, food, money, whatever you've got karmic tendency to be attracted to. And attachment is convinced that when you get it, you'll get satisfaction. It'll take the pain away. That's attachment. It's multifaceted. And then when it doesn't get what it wants, which is 1,000 times a day, or gets what it doesn't want, that's the arising of the third of these three, aversion. Aversion is the bare bones state of mind. So these are the three poisons, and they're running continuously in one level or another in all sentient beings, to degrees of such subtlety that we do not discuss in our modern psychological models with respect. These three are the source of all the other dramas. And these are the main cause of all suffering, of all. And it almost seems too simple, you know. Come on, it can't be that simple. Well, this is what he's found to be true, you know. The three poisons: ego grasping, attachment, aversion, and they're so forget now ignorance. That's under everything. So now let's look at attachment and aversion, because we run between these 1,000 times a day. They're running all the time. They're so primordial. They're so subtle, you know. But this is the tragedy. We only notice them when they're very, very gross. And then it's kind of a bit too late. It's like the analogy I use is like, you're driving on the freeway at 120 kilometers an hour or miles an hour, and you suddenly notice your wheels are falling off. And the problem is you've never thought of wheels falling off because you've never paid attention. You've never paid attention. From the time you brand new car, you never listened for the wheels. You just took it for granted, this self-existent real car, and you only notice the problems when you're having a mental breakdown. That's our tragedy. This is why we kill each other. That's why we kill ourselves, because we wait until it's way too late to notice the problems. Anybody with half a brain would know that when you recognize that things are impermanent, and you learn to check the wheels, you hear the sounds, you hear the things in the car, and you go to your mechanic and you make sure everything's in order. It's rare that wheels fall off in cars because we understand we've got mechanics, but we don't understand we've got mental mechanics. And I'm not even being cliched, I'm being literal. We even look when we go to our therapists. Excuse me, when you're feeling happy in a really nice relationship with Mark, and you're feeling happy, and you don't go to your therapist, you say, what's your problem? Well, actually, we're quite happy, but I want to be prepared for future problems. She'll tell you to go home. She only wants to see you when you're having a mental breakdown. She only wants to see you when your wheels are falling off, with respect to us. But this is just where Buddha's view is so practical. He's given us methods to see our minds well before they become out of control. Then you will never have a mental breakdown. Then your wheels will never fall off, if you do the proper job from day to day. And imagine if we were taught this as we're little. Can you imagine? It's very fascinating, you know. In T.Y.'s notes, she's got a list of all in the later part of the book, I think she goes in order. You know, there's a list of all the other states of mind. We'll go into those later, I think. But I think understanding these three, I tell you, is so insightful, it's so profound. It gives us such enormous understanding of our own mind, you know. So, okay, these mental states. So the sensory consciousness, which are just bare bones cognition, perception, that's how they call it, direct. It doesn't sound very exciting to us, but it's got some meaning as we progress. We'll understand the meaning. Then we've got mental consciousness, and there's two levels at which we can function. There is direct perception, but that's only really when you're a great meditator. And we can't even imagine what that would be like, because we have no equivalent in modern psychology. It's when you've got single-pointed concentration, you've got levels of cognition that are not conceptual, but are not sensory either. They're mental. The best we can do is hear this, you know. But the level we function at is the grosser level, the conceptual level. And this is where, if we really did study in depth the epistemological model, it's totally fascinating. It's really quite complex how conceptuality functions. It's absolutely fascinating. And this is coming directly from the direct experience of the yogis who've unpacked and unraveled their own minds and can actually see the workings of this conceptuality. It's really quite fascinating to study it. It's amazing. I mean, for example, listen to this. The way conceptuality works is this. It's really abstract and it has a negating way of knowing things. It's so abstract, it's fascinating. But what happens is this. The second my eyes see shape and color, my mental consciousness is accessed in a millionth of a second. We know that, quicker than Google. And then what happens is this. You listen to this. My conceptuality will bring up every single phenomenon I've ever known that is not a thermos, and then we'll eliminate those, and what is left is a non-thermos. It's a completely negating abstract process. Super genius, super brilliant. I mean, there's extensive discussions. I mean, I don't talk much about it, but it's so fascinating when you understand it, the way conceptuality works. The mind brings up every phenomenon that is not a thermos, which is called non-thermos, eliminates every one of them, and all this happens in the billionth of a second. And then what you're left with is the phenomenon called a non-thermos. That equals thermos. That's how conceptuality works. Billionth of second by billionth of second by billionth of second. It's more brilliant than the best computer in the universe. And we're discussing not the brain here. We're discussing the conceptual, non-physical capacity for cognition of conceptual consciousness. It's totally fascinating. Totally fascinating. I mean, this is described in great detail in many of the commentaries, It's really fascinating just to read it. It's mind-boggling. We're not going to go into it much at all. I've forgotten half of it, I'm sorry. Because for me, we need to know about it. But the crucial points are to understand the mental consciousness, to understand our conceptual stories, to understand how our emotional states are rooted in being conceptual stories. This is the key application of this model in our daily lives, when it becomes real for us, so powerful. So mind is not physical. Mind is not physical. It exists interdependently upon the physical, so at different levels, So we have to, that's why the sensory and the mental, we have to start to see that for me is the most powerful point in the epistemological model, the distinction between sensory and mental consciousness. Even just theoretically, knowing that eye consciousness sees shape and color. When I look at the shape of Mark, eye consciousness sees shape and color. The rest of it is a story made up by my mental consciousness. This is what's utterly fascinating. All dependent, and this is the workings of attachment and aversion, So like I said, the key, you've got your negative, neurotic, deluded, non-virtuous, disturbing, distressing states of mind, one category. You've got the positive, virtuous, valid, reasonable states of mind, the second category. And you've got the third. So what are some examples of each of these? The first level, you've got your delusions. You've got your three poisons. Then you've got, branches of those, like arrogance and and all those other states of mind that we know so well, I mean, we could discuss half a dozen, basically. We could discuss attachment, aversion, jealousy, arrogance, low self-esteem, and you're just about covered. Every time we ask Lama Yeshe to teach Lorig, this text, we always get so excited. But he would only ever discuss these 4 or 5, because they're the main ones. They're the ones that we touch everyday lives. We need to know all the others. We'll go through them. TY does in her notes. You should read them. And they're necessary to know these parts of our mind. But these are the major ones, These are the ones that run the show for most people. But it's more, the more we know our minds, the more precise we can be in distinguishing between these different states of mind and how they function, So the second examples of the second category, love, compassion, for example. They're both also, this is the interesting point, they're both also conceptual viewpoints, but they're valid. And this is another point that we're going to spend the rest of the month talking about. What does it mean by valid? What does valid mean? It's very fascinating. Here, In Buddha's view, a valid cognition in general, a valid cognition is when the object that is being described and the description are in sync. So clearly attachment is not valid. When I say Mark is so divine, he's the most handsome man in the whole world, he's the cause of all my happiness, I adore him, I'd give my life for him. And then next day he chucks me out for a younger version. And now I build up, and now I tell another story. Mark is evil, he's the worst person in the whole world, I'll never forgive him, and he's the cause of all my suffering. Now they're clearly conceptual stories, aren't they? They're clearly both extreme, distorted assessments of the object called Mark. And the key function of both of these descriptions is that they're exaggerations. And this is the main function of what the Buddha would refer to as afflictions. There's two main functions. One is this is the term disturbing emotion. So attachment is a deeply disturbing emotion. For us, it feels like heaven. We've got to go into this, but in its nature, it's deeply, extremely neurotic, disturbing emotion. That's its first function. Disturbing to whom? To me. And second, it's a liar. That's why you have to understand this attachment comes down to being a conceptual, an exaggerated, distorted assessment of the object called Mark, that in this case over exaggerates his deliciousness and his function in causing me happiness. That's how attachment lies to us. So then when he chucks me out for a younger version and my attachment has been thwarted, then the other state of mind now arises to the surface, which is called aversion. And aversion is the state of mind beneath what's called anger. So now the description is a brand new description, a grossly exaggerated description of the same object as yesterday, virtually. Ugly, horrible, the worst person in the world, never forgive him, and the cause of all my sufferings. So what aversion does is exaggerate. It's also deeply disturbing, and it's evidently disturbing. Attachment's tricky because we think it's nice. But aversion is clear that it's disturbing. I'm freaking out. And it's a delusion. It's a lie. It's a misconception. But this is the part that's hard to see, because he did cheat on me. So you'd think, well, of course I'm angry. Look, he cheated on me. But what we don't see is the lie that he did cheat on me. That's not a lie. He did cheat on me. That's not the lie. The lie is the conceptual story that anger is. And the strength of the aversion is equal to the strength of the attachment. So we run between these two extreme emotions to one degree or another 1,000 times a day. And aversion is the response when attachment is thwarted or doesn't get what it wants or gets what it doesn't want. Attachment runs the show. In the Four Noble Truths, virtually Buddha says that attachment is the main source of day-to-day suffering. The root delusion is the main source, but effectively attachment, the main voice of the root delusion, is effectively the source of our suffering day-to-day and the source of the suffering of all the realms of existence. So to understand these seemingly simple words, ignorance, attachment, aversion, is huge in Buddhist psychology. It's the basis of your practice. It's the basis of being a Buddhist, They're huge. And then we can begin to understand all the other branches, the jealousy, the arrogance, all these other ones, the variations. And all the other T.Y. lists them all in her book. In her notes, it's good to read them. Okay, people, I've got 15 more minutes before I go, and then you've got discussion time. But is there any? No, I think now what I'm going to do is stop, and I'm going to tell you about the power and benefit of debate and how to do it properly. So, of course, we don't have the systems they've got in the Tibetan system, in the monastic university system, which they got from India. It's super sophisticated, super sophisticated, clear way of debating. And so why you have to ask the question, why? What do you mean debating? Discuss sounds very nice, but it's debate. What are we trying to do? This is what's so delicious in the Tibetan monastic university system. that initially just sounds like, oh, that's just intellectual rubbish. It's not intellectual rubbish. This is the point here. When we can begin to understand that the neurotic emotions are rooted deep down in the mind in being informed by conceptual stories, you know, then we'll see, and how they're distorted, they're delusional, then clearly, because we're so familiar with these lies, you have to use wisdom, the second part of your mind, the valid, reasonable states of mind. You have to use the wisdom in your mind to argue with those deluded thoughts. So when I first studied with my philosophy teacher, Geshe Tektok, who was the abbot at our monastery in France, in Nalanda, in the 80s, and then after that he was appointed by His Holiness to be the abbot of Sarah J Monastery, and he passed away a few years ago. When I first studied with him in our center in England in the late 70s and early 80s, I did 2 years of philosophical study. So I'll just tell you my own background for a second, just my own experience, I tell you. So when I first met the Dharma, it was I was 31 or something, 32, I think, in Australia, mid-76. I was 32, yeah, 30, getting on for 32. And I fell into the lap of Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa, you know. I had never heard of Buddhism. I'd heard the word Buddhism, of course, but I'd broken my leg. I'd been doing karate, not my foot. I'd been doing karate and totally committed to my karate career. Felt like this is my path, you know. And then this nice person called Bill Bright, I'll never forget him. I'm so grateful. He ran over my foot in a car accident. I was helping these women push their car in an intersection, and this fellow ran over my foot, just my foot. Don't know how it happened, but just my foot. And I felt the crack, and I fell to the ground, and I could not believe. I thought, no, I can't do karate. I was devastated. And this poor fellow came up to me, and I screamed at him and abused him. I said, you ran over my foot, you know. And he said, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. He was so kind. He took me to hospital, but I was devastated. Anyway, I was sitting there totally self-piteous with a plaster. These days, you just get a boot. They didn't have boots in those days. I broke the 5th metatarsal on my left foot. And 3 months ago, I broke the right foot, the 5th metatarsal on my right foot. So they're both equal now, 45 years later. Anyway, I remember sitting in this restaurant in Melbourne, feeling totally full of self-pity and somehow inappropriately devastated. It seemed like much bigger than it really was. And I looked up on the wall and there was a poster, you know, and it said, all I remember is that it said Lama Yeshe. And until this day, I promise, I'm convinced I'd heard his name before. I think I haven't. This is how karma ripens, you know. I'll never forget this. And because I'd broken my foot, I couldn't do karate because I was studying 6 days a week. I couldn't do it. And because my job had finished, or some job, I had nothing else to do. So I thought I'd go to this course, you know. It was June 76. I did a 1-month intensive Lam Rim course with Lama Zopa, and then a 1-month intensive Chenrezig retreat with Lama Yeshe. And that was when I met the Dharma, you know. And then I found my path, basically, like 2 months. What I'm getting at is this. I knew I'd become a nun. So a year later, I went to Kathmandu and became a nun. It was just clear to me. It was finally, I'd sort of found my path in my life. Everything led to that point. And I started working for Wisdom when we began in England, and I started editing books and things. And I even started editing Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand. But I remember it was just so abstract to me, so weird. I don't know what the hell is this Lam Rim they're talking about. I couldn't get it, you know. I mean, I had a natural feeling for the Buddhist path. I wanted to be a nun. I wanted to work on my mind, but I had no interest in this meditating. I had no interest in this boring old Lam Rim. I didn't know what it meant. But I was happy to be a Buddhist. And then Lama sent us to this center in England. About the second year I'd been a nun. And then I remember hearing there's this Geshe Tektok came along. He came, there were two lamas there. And he started teaching, Lama Yeshe called it the Geshe program. This must have been in, I forget the year, 78. He called it 79. He called it the Geshe program. And I'd heard about Geshes, you know, but I didn't know what they meant. I mean, this sounds very peculiar. I didn't know when I first became a Buddhist, I thought, what do they mean, study philosophy? I had no idea what they meant. I had this strong connection to be a nun and get on with some work. So I was happy to do editing, happy to be doing publishing, but to study, I really didn't know what they meant. And meditating was the most boring thing on the planet. I couldn't sit still for a second. But what was fascinating, I'd see in this first year, Geshe Tektok was studying, and there were all these students, about 40 of them, all studying this Geshe program. And I'd look at them when they're having lunch, all discussing all these abstract ideas. I think, what are they talking about, you know? So the second year of this program, I'll never forget it, I heard the name of one of the texts that they study, and it's called Dura, Collected Topics. And I discovered it was the first text you study in the monasteries. And so all I know is something ripened. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I might like to study that. So I went to Geshe Tech. I said, I'm very busy doing wisdom publications, but can I come to some of the classes? He said, sure, yeah. So all I know is when I went to my first class with my notebook and my pencil, I'd never studied before. I left school when I was 16. I never studied. I never went to university. I thought it was so boring. Who wants all those stupid ideas to learn? I did what I wanted, read what I wanted, did what I wanted in my life. But then it was the first time I ever wanted to quote unquote study. I came with a book and my pencil and I took notes. And all I know is from the first day, I was completely blissed out. It was like, I was 36 by that point. It was like I discovered for the first time what my mind had wanted. Not even the lamb rim did it for me. Karma ripened for me. It was so intense. I did 2 years of study, 4 texts, the major texts, Dura, Dubta, which is Buddhist tenets, Lorig, which is the mind, which we're basing this on, and one called Tari, which is logic. I did these 4 in 2 years. We had exams. We studied 5 days a week. And all I know is I was in complete heaven. I finally found what my mind had wanted. And for me, I can say this is like 100 years ago, like 35 years ago, 40 years ago, nearly that this happened. It's like yesterday. It was like, that's when I discovered the Dharma. That's when I got what my mind was hungry for. And that's when I realized this is the absolute basis. I mean, the lamb rim is everything, but the lamb rim comes from all these texts, you know. So for me, this rigor of studying every day, analyzing, using logic, using analysis, getting clear definitions, unpacking and unraveling, like we're talking here. I could not be talking to you this way, people, if I hadn't done those 2 years of study. That's a fact, you know. For me, it was the most profound experience for me in my life. I was so happy. And it's like yesterday. It was 1980, whatever it was, 79, you know, 1980, whatever that is. It's like so many years ago. Just those 2 years, those 4 texts. I wish I'd done more. My biggest regret, not enough study, you know. But it gave me the absolute basis, the nuts and bolts. And every word I'm saying to you, anything I say has come from my experience in those 2 years, you know, I tell you. It gave me the absolute basis. So from all that, what I'm getting to is debate. So I didn't learn Tibetan. I've never learned Tibetan. And debate in Tibetan is so, because the language is so tight and kind of architectural. So what am I saying? So precise. It's very hard to translate it into English, I think. I don't know if it's even been done, this very system. But the logic, the thing behind debate, which is what I'm getting to about discussion. Okay, we call it discussion. And one of the commonest things that people say, like in a group like this, you'll go, oh, but I don't know anything. How can I discuss? Because it's not discussion. We think discussion means having a nice open-ended, everybody giving their opinions about something. That's just a load of rubbish. That's not what's being done. You think about how, this is where it's the same rigor to the part of your mind that you're using when you study these texts. This is what we're discussing right here as well. What we're discussing here is the same part of your mind that you use. This is surprising to us when you study math. Look at the rigor and clarity and precision of math. You don't discuss is 1 + 1 is 2, or maybe it's 4, or I think it's 7. That's not discussion. That's called stupidity. You discuss 1 + 1 is 2, and you unpack it in order to understand it. So you're taking it as a hypothesis. You're not trying to argue with it. If you can argue with it and prove it to be wrong, then perfect. So the whole point of debate is, in the end, in your daily practice, is what I'm saying before, delusions are liars. Delusions are neurotic, ego-based, frantic, ridiculous belief systems. And we need to use wisdom and clarity and analysis to unpack and unravel them. So that's the meaning of debate. So then what discussion would look like, you two, and 2 of you together is perfect. When in the study that I did, I was working like 60, 40 hours a week for wisdom, but I was so happy to do all this study. We would have a class 90 minutes in the afternoon, and then we would have discussions straight afterwards. And that's what they do in the monasteries. They have their debate at night, you know. So you take what you learned. Lamy actually talks about this, I think, in Mahamudra. You go to you do your classes. They would memorize everything. You know, they take notes now, but we take notes. Then you'd go to your debate yard and you'd rip it to pieces in debate. And the whole purpose of it was to try to cut through ego, to try to get past the lies and the misconceptions of what is real and what is not. Because when you're a Buddha, finally, your mind is in sync with that which exists. There's no longer a distinction. You are enlightened mind. Your mind is in sync with, there's no longer a delusion. There's no longer a disconnect. This is something that, is fascinating. So learning to discuss. So that means that two of you would sit together. You don't have to go, well, what do we discuss? You just know what you've heard in this class. So you discuss precisely what you've heard in this class. If you can remember one thing, well, you discuss that. What did she mean when she said sensory and conceptual? Sensory and mental. You could spend your whole 30 minutes just discussing the difference between conceptual and sensory. That's the point of discussion, to unpack it so you begin to understand it. Not to be right. I mean, we're so arrogant, we think we should give the right answers. This is absurd, You're trying to understand it. So you keep an open mind. What does she mean by sensory? What does she mean by conceptual or mental? And then under mental, you've got these two. What do you mean by conceptual? How is anger a concept? I mean, we haven't gone into it much, but you can certainly begin to discuss. And the point of it is to get some clarity about what you've heard. So anybody, so if two of you have never been to any other Buddhist class, and this is the first class you've been to, you can discuss exactly this, no more and no less than exactly what you've heard. It's a very precise thing, I mean, of course, you don't have to do it. You can leave now when I leave. It's your choice, But those of you who are trying to study it seriously, it's highly recommended. So when I was studying at the center, we're doing 5 classes a week. We had our discussion afterwards, and we'd go one-on-one. It's the best way to do it is one-on-one. Having a discussion with 6 people often means the person who knows everything just talks and just repeats everything. There's no help in that. You've got to unpack the ideas. What does she mean conceptual? What do you mean sensory? What do you mean this? To understand it, what do you mean? I mean, we haven't even begun to give much discussion about these delusions, but we're going to go. But whatever you've heard, to be clear, to be precise. So we would have exams every quarter, we'd have exams, which really energizes you to then study it. You want to study it. So I'd take notes, and every class, if I didn't take notes one class or I missed one class, I'd be sad. I missed out on something. You've got to keep ahead of it. If you don't keep ahead of it, you'll just lose it and forget it, and you won't have interest, That's why discussion is so crucial right at the end of the class. Even just 30 minutes is amazing, I promise. It's so beneficial because it keeps it fresh in your mind. And then that's when the understanding comes. All the people in the monasteries, they all say that the real understanding comes in the debate yard. You listen and then you pull it apart. This is the thing we have to do. This is what's good. And I know for me, when we were doing our exam, sometimes one of us, you'd find your own people, and even among you people, you can find one of you, let's say you know each other, you can become your own private partners. You can call each other on a Wednesday and have a chat, discussing what you've just heard. This is so beneficial. Then what I see is you get enthusiasm. I mean, listen to me, I'm always so enthusiastic, right? This is from 45 years ago, I remember it. It was like yesterday. It was so powerful for my mind, that 2 years of study. And I'd sometimes spend 8 hours going before our exams, 8 hours back and forth. What was that? What was the definition of this one? What's this? What's that? And that's why it's good for you to read TY's notes as well, because she says many things that I don't say. And many things I'm saying you won't find in her notes as well. Okay, people? Because when you've got enthusiasm, then you're joyful, then you're happy. But if you just hear it, you don't study it, and you forget it, then you kind of get depressed and you give up. Oh, I can't cope with all these words. What's going on, You need to put it in your brain, Well, metaphorical brain, your non-physical brain. Okay, honeys, I think I'm finished, okay? So we dedicate, you do proper dedications at the end, but I'm going to dedicate just simply here. Just think, we've been here for 90 minutes, okay? You've been a bit longer. Just think. Don't put the prayers up. Just think. Every second of what we've heard has gone into my mind. So keep it fresh. Aspire to nourish these karmic seeds and continue to work on yourself, continue to understand these topics so you can use these tools to help you develop your amazing potential. So eventually you can help others. And be delighted, okay? All right, darling people. Some of you can go now if you want to continue to discuss. I highly recommend it. It's really worth it. And then find a friend and you can talk when you feel like it,